Good day, and thanks for joining Dr. Mike Wahl and I today for this presentation on musculoskeletal injury prevention, titled Preparing for Work, Tips to Avoid Pain and Discomfort. Dr. Wahl is a professor at Memorial University in the Faculty of Medicine and host of NTV's primetime show, Health Explored. I'm so grateful that he happily accepted the invitation to co-facilitate today's session, and he's going to share some of his knowledge about the protection of worker health and wellness, as he's certainly got a wealth of experience and education in this subject matter. So I'm Cheryl Osborne, of course, Health and Safety Advisor with WorkplaceNL, and we'll together be co-facilitating this session. So before we get started, if at any point throughout the session you need to get up and move around, of course, do so. And we obviously encourage you to do that because that's actually an MSI prevention measure, is to try to break up static sitting time. So we encourage you to move around throughout the session, but we will also have a micro break at the 30-minute interval.
All right, so I get to join in today and share a little bit about the experience I've had working in safety-sensitive environments. And one of the things that always stood out to me when we're looking at health and safety is we try and control what we're able to control in order to reduce the risk of injuries. And so anybody who spends time at a safety-sensitive workplace would be accustomed to seeing things like a requirement to wear steel-toed, steel-shank boots. And the reason why is because somebody along the way ended up dropping something on their toe, and maybe they had an amputation of their toe as a result of this dropped object. And as health and safety professionals, we said, hey, we need to remedy this, so let's end up putting a control measure in place. So we said, okay, steel-toed boots are a requirement at the job site. The next thing we see a lot of is safety glasses, and we wear safety glasses because something could fly up and hit us in the eye, and that could end up leading to a chance of blindness. And when we look at those amputation risks and the chance of hurting our eyes, it's about 1 in 20,000 workers will have an injury now because of these control measures in place, which is quite low. Of course, no injuries are acceptable, but at the same time, the risk is quite low at this point. And then the last thing we see is that we see a hard hat here, and we always wear hard hats on a site because something could fall and could hit us in the head and cause an injury to our head or our brain, which would be, of course, something that's very traumatic for us and we don't want to have. But when we look at these risk factors, we've been able to control these down to a fraction of what their previous incidence was. But when we look at the health side of things, well, when we're looking at the injuries we still see in the workplace, they're actually things like our soft tissue injuries these days. And the way that I like to think about this is a little story that shows that sometimes we go a little bit far down a rabbit hole, and we should also look at the bigger picture. And so this story is about Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson. And most people know about these two. Sherlock Holmes was eccentric, crazy detective, but he was able to solve the crimes. But the reason he was able to do this was because he had Dr. Watson with him. And Dr. Watson was sort of straight and narrow, very analytical, and together they made a really good team, like yin and yang. And in this story, what they were doing was they were trying to catch a criminal that was hiding in the woods. And this criminal would sneak out from the woods in the middle of the night, do a heist, and sneak back in, kind of like Robin Hood, but a bad guy. And the problem was, once he got back in the woods, no one could ever find him because he knew him like the back of his hand. So they said, how are we going to catch this guy? And they said, okay, well, what we're going to do is we're going to stake out the woods. We're going to set up a perimeter with some booby traps and some alarms. And when he sneaks out to do that heist, we're going to catch him in the act, and then we're going to solve the crime and be the heroes. They said, okay, we'll set up the perimeter. But then we came out at like 3 a.m. So it was about midnight, and they said, we got a couple hours to get some shut eye before we have to go on watch. So they set up their little tent and they got some sleep. Well, a few minutes later, or a little while later, Sherlock Holmes turns to Dr. Watson and he says, Watson, what do you deduce? And Watson listens carefully, and he doesn't hear the booby traps going off, and he doesn't think they've caught the criminal. So he thinks, well, maybe Holmes is getting a little bit philosophical at this point. So he looks up at the stars, and he does what any philosophical guy would do. And he says, well, Holmes, I see millions and millions of stars, and I'd have to assume, according to science, that around those stars, there's billions and billions of planets. And on those planets, there has to be some planets that have oxygen and water, and therefore life like ours. So what do I deduce? I deduce we are not alone in the universe. Why? What do you see? And Holmes turns to Watson. He's like, wow, Watson, that's really deep and 100% accurate. But, at the same time, I'm just wondering why we can see the stars. I think Buddy stole our tent. And that's one of the things I think we're missing in workplace safety these days, is that we're trying to control the smaller and smaller incident occurrences, but we're kind of missing the big picture. And one of the biggest pictures that we face in workplace still is musculoskeletal injuries. And I think we need to take some different approaches. And today we're going to share some of the best practices we've come across in our career with you today, so that you can hopefully address this thing, which is still a very relevant concern in the workplace.
Yes, and that's right. Our statistics here in Newfoundland and Labrador definitely back up what Dr. Wahl was saying here. If you look at our statistics over the last 25 years, soft tissue injuries, or we also call them musculoskeletal injuries, really haven't seen much of a decline here in the province. And in fact, in the past 7 years, practically it's plateaued. So we do still have a lot of work to do in the health side, for sure. And looking at that bigger picture. So as health and safety professionals, as Dr. Wahl has said, you know, we've done a pretty good job at reducing the safety injuries, but we still have a ways to go. And we need to effectively start looking at and managing the health hazards, the hazards that damage the musculoskeletal system. Specifically, with musculoskeletal injuries here in the province, if you look at the last 5 years, on average, they account for 69% of all the claims involving lost time from work, and pretty well 3/4 actually of the costs. And so 2/3 of the number of claims, 3/4 of the costs, just about, and 3/4 of all the lost time weeks from work of all workers in the province, and looking at all types of injuries. So that's pretty significant. That $109 million of annual claims costs a year, you know, that's a pretty big number for a small province like ours. But this doesn't even factor in the indirect costs of an injury, you know, things like costs associated with hiring and training replacement workers, for example. And the Occupational Safety and Health Administration, or OSHA, they estimate that the yearly indirect costs associated with MSIs may be upwards to about 5 times the direct costs. So if you think about the direct costs being that 109 million in our province every single year, the indirect is pretty significant. And then if you throw in the fact that we have an aging workforce here in the province, and generally MSIs tend to develop over, you know, a long period of time. Many of them, they manifest themselves in an injury over the period of several weeks or months, or maybe even several years. So if you really think about that, it's a little bit concerning and alarming, in that we might even potentially see our incidence rates start to increase here in the province. So knowing all this, of course, you know, make no wonder health and safety professionals are starting to try and look outside and look at the bigger picture and figure out other methods that we can address these types of injuries beyond just our standard ergonomics programs. Specifically in our province, the top 10 occupations having MSIs, or musculoskeletal injuries, is, well, the top 4 of 5 are nursing occupations, so PCAs, LPNs, registered nurses, and visiting homemakers and related occupations. And then we have light duty cleaners, so, you know, they're in every single industry. And if you really look at these occupations here, there's a lot of manual handling of loads and manual handling of people. And with some of the other occupations like retail salespersons, for example, and potentially the truck drivers as well, we're seeing situations where there could be, you know, light duties, but then there may be some high force demands to lift, and maybe for the truck drivers offloading when they get to their destination, for example. And then you see the janitors as well. So cleaners, janitors make up a high number, or a percentage, of the injuries, MSI injuries in our province. Heavy equipment operators, you know, sedentary posture is going on here. And that's another risk factor for MSI. And ambulance paramedics, now we're looking at, you know, peak force demands. These workers could be sedentary for a long period of time, and then they get a call, an emergency call, and have to go off. It could be, you know, some very uncontrollable work environments that they're working in. It could be a road accident where, you know, they may have to, you know, potentially hold spine immobilization for long periods of time. So there's really peak force demands on the body after a period of prolonged, potentially prolonged sitting or physical inactivity. And so the risks there can be quite increased. These are the top 10, but, you know, MSI risk factors are in every single occupation and job type. And so we really need to be looking outside and not really focusing just on, office workers. They don't even make up the top 10, but oftentimes when we think of ergonomics and MSI prevention, we think about offices, desk workers, seated workers, but it goes far beyond just that. Okay, so today, this is the agenda for today, and we actually just covered the first one. Why focus on MSI prevention? Well, the statistics tell us that it's very important that we do in order to control costs. So not just costs, obviously, but health, human health, most importantly. We're going to just do a little introduction on MSIs, and for some of you, maybe an overview. Perhaps we'll look at work preparation recommendations or some methods for various types of work. And then we're going to talk about stretching a little more because there seems to be some confusion in the workplace regarding what types of stretching are beneficial for workers who do physically demanding work versus sedentary workers who are doing a micro break. So we'll hopefully address any confusion that you might have in that way. So with respect to musculoskeletal injuries, or MSI for short, you'll probably hear me say MSI mostly now moving forward. Basically what we're referring to are for the most part, the soft tissues of the body. So we have our musculoskeletal system is made up of several bones and then a bunch of soft tissues that branch off of these bones to help us be able to move. We have ligaments that connect bones, one end of a bone to another, and that helps keep our obviously our bones and joints intact. But then you have muscles that connect to a bone by way of a tendon, and these are soft tissues that help us to be able to move and do our daily activities and everything, our activities, daily living. And when we injure any of these soft tissues, or if we have joint injuries, typically they're called musculoskeletal injuries. So these are the tissues of the musculoskeletal system. And just to look at the picture here as an example, this is an arm, and muscles cause the bones to move. So that bicep muscle here, if it contracts, well then it pulls the bottom bones up, and therefore your elbow would bend. So all these soft tissues have an important role to play in the function of our body and how we move and do our activities. So when we injure these, they're considered a musculoskeletal injury. And the topic for today and preparing for work and stretching and things really is hitting on the sprains and strains types of musculoskeletal injuries. So with a strain, that's if a tear or a stretch of a muscle or tendon takes place. And so those are called muscle strains, and sprains is when there's a tear, a stretch or a tear of a ligament. And there's different degrees of severity for these. With these types of injuries, sometimes you may experience minor symptoms at first and gradually they worsen and develop into full-blown injury, potentially a complete tear, for example. But they could also happen suddenly as well. So musculoskeletal injury, the term, and by legislation, is an injury or disorder of muscles, tendons, ligaments, joints, nerves, blood vessels, and related soft tissue. And that could include inflammation, sprains, strains, and other types of injuries. And some examples would be carpal tunnel syndrome, bursitis, epicondylitis, tendonitis, or you may have heard of tennis elbow, golfer's elbow. These are all examples of MSIs, just to name a few. It's really a cumulative, or I guess it's an umbrella term that we use to talk about all these different injuries and disorders of the musculoskeletal system. And we in our province often call them soft tissue injuries, but you may hear musculoskeletal disorder from resources in other jurisdictions like Ontario, for example. Repetitive strain injuries, cumulative trauma disorders, they all mean the same thing.
Yeah, so one of the things that I used to run into a lot was how do these injuries actually occur? Because if we're safety professionals and we're trying our best to be able to mitigate the risk, we have to understand the mechanism which causes the injuries to begin with. And so if you look at these three different graphs here, these are three different ways that injuries can occur in the workplace. Now, the first one doesn't happen as much in an organization that's implementing safety processes because people will have guidelines to not overload their system. But this is what happened a lot in the past. And so if we look at this graph here, you see there's two little peaks. The first one is a smaller peak, and then there's a larger one where it has failure written above it. And what this is saying is the body can have a certain amount of force put on it before it gives out. So we go to pick up something, for example, and it's really heavy, and our back can sustain a certain amount of a load, and then we lift more than it can sustain, and then we hurt ourselves. And that's what used to happen. And as a result of that, we said, oh, this isn't good. Let's make sure that we have lifting limits so that people aren't overdoing at the workplace. If it's more than 50 pounds, you can't lift it without a buddy system or an ergonomic aid of some sort. And so what's been able to happen is we created this thing called a margin of safety. So this margin of safety is saying, look, I'm lifting something 25 pounds, so I've got lots of room before I get to this failure tolerance where I hurt my back and throw my back out. And so that's what safety systems and lifting limits have done. They've been able to keep us from going to this failure tolerance where people aren't overdoing by doing a single overloaded lift or movement for their body. And that's really important. And that's where a lot of organizations have been successful so far. But the reality is, the way we lift things and the way we work typically isn't just one lift. And usually it can't be controlled in the same way, because what we see is, even if you're working at this lower load, and we look at this repetition graph here, you see that there are these small little micro exertions here. And what happens over time is, this could be over the course of months, it could be the course of a day, but over time, after doing repetitive forces, our body gets these little micro traumas in our soft tissues. We've all been in exercising before or had a really physical activity weekend where the next day we're really stiff. Well, that's our body having these little micro traumas in them. So when we expose ourselves to repetitive loads over long periods of time, we cause this damage, our muscles get fatigued, there's a variety of things that happen. And all of a sudden, what was once really safe for us when we were fresh and rested becomes something that can cause an injury. So I had an example of working in an organization one time where they used to slide the really important information under the door of the senior supervisor every single morning so that no one else could read it, because it was, of course, private information. And they came into their office one day and they bent over to pick up the paper and they threw their back out. And then they were like, no more paper on the floor, it's too much of a risk. And I was like, it's not the paper, it's the fact that the individual is got a body that's in a position where it's susceptible to injury because of micro trauma, maybe sitting too long, maybe being inactive, maybe they had a hard weekend in the garden, who knows. So that's how repetition works. And the last one, I've got an example of one time where I was working with oil and gas client, and we were unloading groceries. And so they had a proper conveyor belt that was all set up, and they would take the big heavy containers, put on the conveyor belt, and take it right to the cooler. But when they got to the cooler, they had to take it off the rack and they had to put it at different levels of shelves. And so while they were organizing it, because obviously it's like a little bit like Tetris trying to put all these groceries in for a month's worth of food for 100 people, they started to rearrange things. And one individual who was extremely strong took the container of milk, and it had 4 2-liters in it, and was holding it. And the person in the fridge said, hold on a second, I need to rearrange something. So instead of putting it back in the conveyor belt, he held it for a little bit longer. Now, this person worked out all the time. They were extremely strong. But what happened was they had this big load in their arms for a long period of time, and they held it for too long. And so this sustained load ended up causing the muscle to cramp up, and he ended up tearing his bicep, the exact muscle we showed in the previous slide. And so what we can see is that we can do too much in the first one by overexerting, we can do too many with repetition, or we can do too long and get fatigue. And these are all ways that we can manifest injuries that are very common. So we have to be cognizant of this in the workplace to control these. These things can come from forces and vibration and repetition. Think about power tools, for example. They can come from working in awkward postures for long periods of time, where little muscles that aren't supposed to contract for an extended period of time, like overhead work, for example, can become fatigued very quickly because they're not designed for that. And you can also have sustained posture. This can be something as simple as sitting or working with a contact point where you're putting a compression against your forearms when you're working at a desk doing some electronics repair, for example, or it could be something like contact stress where you're leaning up against something in a bad posture for a long period of time. So there's lots of ways that we can manifest these injuries.
So now we're going to look at some work preparation strategies to try to prevent the MSIs from these risk factors. And we're going to look particularly at 3 types of work, starting with sedentary work, which in this case, we're talking about static sitting, or it could be static standing as well, or like Mike had referred to, reaching overhead for a prolonged period of time, or bending down for a prolonged period of time. It's essentially sedentary work is work that involves little or very little or no physical activity. So here we're thinking about, certainly office workers are susceptible to too much sitting time. But we have workers at service desks as well, maybe not necessarily confined to a computer, but in sedentary postures, working at production lines, working in laboratories maybe, control room workers, air traffic control workers, long distance drivers. So these are just some of the examples. And when you think about, the computer this day and age, previously the nature of work required workers to move around the office. But now, for the most part, almost everything, like for example, filing that used to be done physically, having to go to a filing cabinet, everything is now being done by the click of a mouse. And this is beneficial in many ways in regards to increased productivity and that sort of stuff, but it does come at a risk to the musculoskeletal system. So some of the recommendations that we want to provide today is off shift. Of course, you need to make sure that you're fitting in enough physical activity because we are biophysically designed to move. Humans are designed to move, and the benefits go far beyond just physical in nature. There's improved mental health, like improved anxiety incidents or associations with anxiety, depression, dementia, cognition, quality of life. And if we work in static sitting or static standing postures all day long or all shift long, I guess, we need to be making sure that we are fitting in enough physical activity outside of our work time. And there are Canadian physical activity guidelines to help follow, that have been developed by experts. And essentially it says we need 150 minutes of moderate to vigorous aerobic physical activity a week, in addition to 2 sessions of strength exercise as well for muscle strength. And when you think about some of the work activities that we do, like sedentary types of work, it can cause weakening of muscles. And if we want to go on and live later in life to be independent, then this is really important. We need to be taking care of our bodies now and throughout our life, not just later. On shift, we want to be looking at things like getting regular movement because prolonged static postures are very unhealthy for the body. It impacts blood flow. It can cause things like varicose veins, blood clotting, even swelling in the legs and feet, particularly here now talking about sitting, but also static standing, same sort of issues. So we want to, if you don't have a lot of opportunity in your work based on the duties that you have to change your posture throughout the day, you want to be making sure that you're strategically or consciously building in micro breaks. So if you don't have that natural break in changing your duties and therefore changing your posture throughout the day, build in some micro breaks. And if you do work in static postures, often what happens is that we start to develop really awkward postures. If we start to work in static postures, let me back up. If we work in static postures often and for prolonged periods, what we often tend to do is turn into awkward postures. For example, after we sit so long, we start to slump forward in our chair and our shoulders come forward. And this can create muscle imbalances. So stretching is a good way to try and prevent or alleviate any muscle imbalances that you may have and some tension that you may be experiencing. And we'll talk about some types of stretches shortly that can be done for sedentary work. One thing we suggest is that you leverage technology, smart watches, these wearable fitness trackers, these types of devices are pretty much mainstream today. And they can track a lot of different things, including, how much sitting time you have. They can give you reminders to get up and move after so long, just like the picture shows here. But it can track several other health markers as well, like, for example, your blood pressure, your heart rate, and much, much more. So these are some things that you can consider. For active or dynamic work here, we're talking about workers who have a lot of movement throughout their day and perhaps even a lot of physically demanding tasks that they perform. So manual material handling, for example, or client or patient handling activities. And for these types of workers, it is really important that they have proper conditioning and fitness for the type of work that they do. Otherwise, they're at an increased risk of an injury. So with this type of work where workers are pretty active and mobile and perhaps lifting and handling throughout the day, it's important that they have good range of motion about their joints, because if not, it's very hard to use good body mechanics to do these types of work activities like bending down to pick up a load. Muscular strength and conditioning, of course, would be important depending on the type of physical demands your job involves. But sufficient recovery is something that we need to consider as well for this type of work. If we are very physically active in our job and then we leave and go to the gym, perhaps we haven't given our bodies enough time to rest and recover. So we do need to be considering that too. And pre-shift warm-up stretching is something that we also recommend for this type of work. So where workers are active in their job, it is important that their body is warmed up and their soft tissues are have good blood flow and are ready to meet the demands of the work ahead. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that now shortly. Then we have occupations where workers may be sedentary for a period of time or just engaging in quite low physical activity to do their duties, but then they may have periods where they have to do some very physically demanding work. So you think about delivery drivers, for example, may have to sit for a period of time to get to the destination and then get out and offload the vehicle, or ambulance workers, paramedics, firefighters, I think about it there too. So for this type of work, we would say that your fitness for work is something that you need to pay attention to. You need to be fit for the work that you do. You need to be able to, your body needs to be able to tolerate the physical demands of the job. And sometimes when we, some job positions require fitness or physical screenings, but then once the worker's in the job, there's no further follow-up after that, and the worker becomes deconditioned. But it's important that we really be mindful of our physical conditioning because it could put us at an increased risk of an injury. Pre-activity warm-up stretching would be recommended for these workers as well before they get into the physical demands of the job. And during the sedentary period of work, then it is also important for these people to be getting regular movement and changes in posture to improve blood flow and to stretch to address any muscle imbalances that may be occurring.
All right, so now we're going to get into a section that I've spent a lot of time working with in industry, and that is looking at stretching and how do we actually implement these control measures in the workplace? Because one of the things we need to be able to do is get people to get on side for these types of MSI prevention strategies because they're highly individualized, but they also have universal sort of concern and physiology that we're going to cover a little bit now. And we're not going to get too deep into the muscle physiology thing here, but what I can tell you is that within a muscle, there are these little fibers, and they work like cross bridges, almost like Velcro, that allow the muscles to shorten and then lengthen. And so what they're constantly doing is they're sliding back and forth, and it's actually called the sliding filament theory. And we don't need to get too specific into it, but we know that when we stretch them or we move them too quick or we contract them too hard, we can damage these cross bridges, which is what leads to a lot of these soft tissue injuries. The other thing we need to recognize, and this came up when we were talking about what an MSI is, there can also be damage to the nerves. And the reason why there can be damage to the nerves or the muscle is that the muscles are controlled by the central nervous system, and that's our spinal cord or our brain. And so every single muscle in our body is going to have this connection back to the central nervous system that's giving it commands. Where do I move in space? What's happening right now? How do I contract? How do I lengthen it? And so understanding that there's this connection between this massive muscle tissue and our nervous system allows us to be able to say, look, if we want to make our body more attuned to the movements we're about to do in the workplace, if we're going to try and make it more resilient to expect the loads and the damage that potentially could be exposed to during the work, we need to make sure this connection between the brain and the muscle is adequate and warmed up. And so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the benefits of stretching. The first thing is that warming up reduces our risk of injury. And warming up can only take a few minutes. And we're going to do a few stretches here in a little bit. And we're going to have a micro break coming up very shortly where I might walk you through some of these and then we'll review them in the slide. But essentially what we do is we decrease the viscosity of the fluids in our muscles, and our muscles are full of blood and water and different tissues. And so by warming them up, it allows us to be able to reduce this risk of injury, just like you see the F1 racers warming up their car tires before a big race. The other thing it does is it improves our balance and spatial awareness because it allows us to know where we are in space. Because, well, if you wake up and you're at a job site where you can roll out of bed and directly be on shift because maybe you're at a mining site or a camp somewhere, you need to be ready to go the second you start work. And you don't have that period of time to drive to work, to wake up, to have coffee, spend time with the family. So improving balance, spatial awareness is important. This decreases your slips, trips, and poor lifting techniques because you're aware of where your body is in space, and as a result, it lessens the muscle strain and the risk in lengthened positions. So we're going to do one more slide here, and then I'm going to put us through a little bit of a micro break. Okay, so the first thing is that if you have poor flexibility, you're at 2.5 times higher risk for injury than people with normal flexibility. That's a significantly greater risk. It's 250%. So that's 2.5 times higher than normal flexibility. And normal flexibility isn't fantastic. It's just adequate. But when we look at good flexibility, when you compare that to people with poor flexibility, they're 8 times less likely of having a risk of injury. When we look at soft tissue injuries as being one of the major concerns when it comes to our workplace injuries, and we see that some people can be 8 times less likely to develop an injury, that's a huge opportunity for improvement. And what we're going to do right now is we're going to do a couple of little stretches. I'm going to walk you through it verbally, and then we're going to see the slide later on, but we're going to do a stretch right now. When Cheryl was talking, I caught myself slouching. We're standing as we give this seminar, and I found myself in an awkward posture. So getting up and being able to do a few things would be really important. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you some little dynamic stretches, some examples of things that we used to do, and I'm going to do my best to describe this with using audio right now. So what I want you to do is we're going to take our break. I want you to sit up nice and straight, or stand. Standing would probably be better. And what I want you to do is I want you to do a head turn. And for a head turn, you're going to be looking straight ahead. You're looking down or looking up, and you're going to turn your head from one side over to, say, the right shoulder, and then back to the middle, and then over to the other side. And I want you to keep on doing this while I'm talking. And I want you to do this about 5 to 10 times on either side. I don't want you to try and turn your head backwards. I want you to just go to a nice, comfortable range of motion, not force it too much, just to the side, a nice, comfortable range of motion. You're not trying to improve your range. You're just trying to maximize what you currently have at this point. Okay, so from there, we're going to go from the head, and we're going to move down to the shoulders. So the next thing I want you to do is stick your arms out to the side. Try not to hit anything or anybody next to you. If you're listening to this with a buddy, stick your arms out to the side like a T. And I want you to do is I want you to do small little rotations with your shoulders forward. I want you to steadily make them bigger. Again, if you feel any pain or discomfort at any time, you stop. Keep on doing this while I'm talking. Make them bigger and bigger, nice and slow, nice and controlled. If you feel any pain, stop at one point. Then we're going to go the opposite direction. So now I want you to go backwards, start big, and then make them smaller as you go. So what are you doing? You're waking up your shoulder, all those little rotator cuff muscles, which are so susceptible to injuries. From there, we want to work on the big muscles at the front of our chest and in our back. So we're going to do arm swings. Stay in that T position. And now what you do is I want you to cross your arms across your chest, and then I want you to bring them out so your elbows go back behind your body. So you're feeling a contraction in the front of your chest and then a stretch in your chest. You're feeling a contraction in your back and then a stretch in your back. You're swinging back and forth. Again, don't feel any pain, just a nice, comfortable range of motion for this. And we're going to do this a couple more times. Now we sort of warmed up the upper body and the neck. We're going to look at the lower back, because the core is an area that can get really injured quite easily, and back injuries are of course common. 80% of us are going to develop one at some point in our life. So put your hands on your shoulders or put your hands across your chest. I want you to stand with your legs shoulder width apart, and I want you to turn to the side, to the right, and then turn to the left. Again, not over rotating at the waist, you're just twisting at the waist. Your upper body is kind of like a sprinkler in the yard, going back and forth, and you can feel those muscles in your lower back and your abdominals stretching. Okay, now we got to work on the lower body. So you want to take your arms, you want to put them in front of your body, put your feet shoulder width apart. If you're wearing shoes with heels, for example, maybe just pop the shoes off for a second so you're nice and flat footed. And I want you to do a squat. You look straight ahead, you keep your upper back nice and straight up, and you squat down to a nice comfortable range. You might hear your knees popping a little bit like popcorn, and that's completely normal for a lot of people. And this is why you do a warm up, because if you don't do a warm up, that first lift you pick up, that heavy thing in the warehouse, or you pick up that big box of paper, that's when those knees go, but now they're under force, and that's when the injury occurs. So we do this, nice little warm up, no pain, no discomfort, maybe a little bit of creakiness, that's completely normal. And then you've warmed up your lower body. And the last thing I want you to do is almost like the hokey pokey. I want you to give yourself a nice stable base of support, grab onto something, stand on one foot, put your right foot forward, and I want you to do ankle rotations by rotating your foot forward. And then I want you to rotate it from the right and then go to the left and then switch ankles. And let's do a few on the other side. So that literally took about 3 minutes to do. And if we think about that, if somebody was to do, say, a 5-minute warm up 5 days a week at their workplace, they're doing 25 minutes of active stretching every week, which is the equivalent of a yoga class. And I think that there's a lot of people in our communities that never do a half an hour, almost a half an hour of flexibility work per week. And if we see that that could take somebody from being in a poor flexibility range to a normal flexibility range, that's going to reduce the risk of injury of your workforce by 2.5 times if they're in a poor flexibility. but maybe they end up doing it for a while and they become good at flexibility and end up becoming actually resilient against soft tissue injuries. So that's really the point of what we're saying. It doesn't have to be huge changes, but little changes over time are what make a big difference when it comes to these injuries.
Can I just add one thing too, Mike? Just go back to the aging workforce.
Mm.
You know, as we age, our range of motion starts to decline as well. So perhaps even more important for the aging workforce to be doing this.
And as we start to lose muscle mass, we start to tighten up and our body has to work harder to do what it used to do easily. And that's one of the things that we saw a lot with workforces is that as people become more senior in their positions, they become more sedentary because they're so good at doing what they're doing. They guide other people and they don't change their behavior. They don't change their lifestyle. So they have to incorporate things in to compensate for the fact they might not be as active. And here's an example of when we used to work offshore, when people would go to don their flight suits, we would make them stretch beforehand. And this actually became mandatory for a lot of workforces. And we saw significant changes in soft tissue injury rates with these organizations. And as a result, not only were the people healthier and happier, but they also had a significant cost savings within the company. They were able to track it because most organizations that have a robust health and safety system are looking at types of injuries, where they occur. And when you're able to see one column dropping significantly, you can put a lot of faith that intervention you're putting in place is actually working. So when you're doing these dynamic stretches, just to review, you want to make sure that you're doing them in a comfortable range of motion, and you want to do a sort of a repeated range, which means you're not trying to increase the range of motion, you're trying to work with what you got. Now, every single person is different. So if you had a generic source of stretching program for everybody, you want to make sure that that program is going to work for each person, because somebody may have had a surgery or an injury and they might need some additional consulting to make sure they're doing something that's safe. The best role with this is just to not do it if it's going to aggravate you, and make sure that you get some support to find the right thing. But for most individuals, you do a comfortable repeated range of motion. You want to do a short duration. 10 seconds or less is considered dynamic stretching. Even if you were to hold your arm in what we would call a traditional stretch, reaching across our body to stretch out our shoulder. If it's less than 10 seconds, it's considered dynamic. It's not going to be long enough to fatigue our body. Again, we want it to be controlled, we want it to be deliberate, and we want to make sure it's as coordinated as possible, which can be challenging for people, and you'll actually see yourself improve on these stretches over time. You want to involve active joint and muscle movement. You want to be able to stretch the joint and the muscle. That's what allows us to have this protection. And more than anything, it wakes up the body. It gets the blood moving, and it actually improves the mood of the individual doing it. They feel good afterwards. And I've seen lots of organizations have fun with this. They play some music if they're doing a pre-shift warm-up, or they set a time in the office where everybody gets up together and does it. And it adds a sense of community and sort of shared experience, so people don't feel awkward doing it on their own. It can help speed up our metabolic processes, decrease the internal viscosity of our blood. So just like oil, it would warm up. It increases the speed and force of our contraction. Our body's more aware of what it's doing. If we do slip on an icy surface and our body's warmed up, the likelihood of us being able to respond quicker is higher. Increase the rate of oxygen to active muscles. Our entire body works on oxygen, and that's what blood's carrying as it takes it to muscles. So we increase blood flow. That's going to increase the oxygen and make our muscles more responsive. Increase our reaction time, and of course it's going to warm you up. In particular, winter is coming at different times of year for different seasons, different places, and if you work in a cold, wet environment, this is one way to be able to keep the body warm when you might be working in an external environment that's cold. The next thing we're going to look at is what's called static stretching. And static stretching is different than dynamic stretching. And what static stretching is when you hold a stretch for 30 to 90 seconds. And typically this isn't necessarily recommended at the workplace. This is something that people do after work when they're at home and they're looking at improving that range of motion. Dynamic stretching is about improving the range of taking the range of motion we have and making it as efficient as possible. Static stretching is when you take a stretch and you hold it for long enough to actually change the muscle and the joint flexibility. So you're going to hold these stretches for like 30 to 90 seconds. And these are the examples of the individual here standing at a chair, grabbing their leg and pulling it up behind them. Now, this doesn't necessarily increase the body temperature of the body, but it is found to be effective at increasing flexibility and range of motion in your joints, but the timing of it is important. And it should be completed at the end of the workday. Because like anything, if you're going to contract a muscle for 30 to 90 seconds, that's fatiguing. And so if you fatigue a muscle before you go into the workplace, what are you doing? You're potentially making yourself more susceptible for an injury, because at this point now you've actually put yourself at a disadvantage. You're further along on that fatigue chart that I showed you earlier, where an injury could be a little higher. It's not going to dramatically increase any risk, and it's likely going to be protective in the long run. But we always tell people Save your static stretching for the end of the day when you're at home and your muscles are done their task for the day, and that's where you're going to get the most benefit. Now, we just went through this, but here's an example of a slide you can use just for some generic ideas around pre-shift stretches. We talked about head turns. We went side to side. We did arm circles to warm up those shoulders in a T position. We did some arm swings to wake up the chest and the back. Then we moved down to the core to wake up the torso with a torso twist. Then we did a body weight squat to get those knees and lower body muscles, which are some of the biggest muscles in our body, going. And then finally worked on ankle rotations, which is like our neck, smaller joints, greater range of motion, but also more likely to get injured at a certain point. The next thing we're going to look at is a static stretch. I'm going to hand this back over to Shirley after this, but we're going to start off with a head side to side stretch. So for this one, I want you to imagine that you're sitting up nice and straight and you're sitting at your desk, and you take your ear and you move it over to your shoulder. And you can do this with me because it's going to be great for you. And you're only going to hold this for about 10 seconds. Go over to the side, hold this over to one side. Now, if you're at home later on that night and you want to hold it for longer, you can hold it for 30 to 90 seconds. And then you're going to take your ear and you're going to move it over on the other side to your shoulder on that side. And then, so that's going to work on the side to side movement of your neck, which is a type of injury that occurs quite often with people. For the rhomboid, what you're going to do with this one, the rhomboids are those big muscles that we get knots between our spine and our shoulder blades. So if you ever had a massage before, massage therapist usually works on that muscle that's in between your shoulder blades and your spine. So to stretch this out, what you do is you take your arm, you put it across your chest with one hand at about shoulder level, and you pull your arm across your chest. And it's a little bit hard to explain over audio, but essentially what you're going to try and do is you're going to feel that shoulder blade pull away from your spine and stretch that muscle, and that's your rhomboid stretch. So again, you'd hold that for about 10 seconds if you're at work, and then you'd switch sides. If you wanted to get some flexibility over time, you'd hold that 30 to 90 seconds after work. The next one we're going to look at is an arm overhead stretch. So for this one, what you do is you take, for example, we'll start with your right arm, you lift it straight up, straight up next to your ear, and so that you reach down the back of your shoulder with your right hand, and you're going to slightly push on the elbow of the right arm, and that's going to stretch out that tricep muscle, which is on the underside of your arm. You're going to feel a bit of a stretch to your armpit too. Hold that for a few seconds, and then we go to the other side and do the same thing. One of the most common sites for injury is our wrist, and so we can develop things like carpal tunnel. We can get ganglions in our wrist. There's all sorts of different things that can occur with this. So with the wrist, you can either bend it forward or you can bend it back. So what you're going to do with this one is you're going to take your arm, put it straight out in front of your body. You're going to point your wrist down towards the ground, and you're going to slightly put some pressure with your opposite hands to kind of stretch that wrist down into a fully flexed position. And then you're going to take your wrist, you're going to put it up so your palm is facing directly in front of you, and you're going to place your other hand against your fingers, and you're going to slightly stretch that back. And that's going to stretch those muscles on either side of your wrist, those muscles that can get really tight and can sometimes lead to some injuries for us. Now, the next one's a pretty tricky one. You might need to look this up online afterwards, but it's called a piriformis stretch. So just imagine you're sitting in your chair. I want you to take your foot, put it across your knee, and I want you to sit with one leg crossed, essentially, sit up nice and straight, and then press down on your knee to be able to stretch that piriformis on the other side. And then lastly, we have a hamstring stretch. So sit down in your chair, stick your legs out directly in front of you, nice and straight, pull your toes back towards you, and you're going to feel a stretch behind your knees, and then press them out. So you're sitting straight, and then pressing them out, just like you're in your car, but your legs are suspended in air. And that's the stretching so far.
Okay, and so Dr. Wahl, just to clarify, for sedentary workers, these exercises that we just went through, those stretches, the static ones, they can be done certainly at the end of the day for longer holds, but they could also be done for micro breaks periodically throughout the day, and you would recommend that, correct?
Exactly. For 10 seconds when you're at work, you hold those stretches for about 10 seconds. At the end of the day, if anybody, whether they're an active worker or a sedentary worker, wants to do those stretches but hold them for a longer period of time, those are also going to be really beneficial. But that's 30 to 90 seconds later on.
Right. Perfect. Okay, so now we're going to move along. This section is about putting the H back in HSE, or health safety environment. And we're going to first talk about workplace stretching programs. And sometimes workplaces will develop programs for their workplace. And actually, I'm seeing that they're much more common this day and age, and in all industries. Is, you know, once we heard about the oil and gas at one point in time, but I think it's pretty much safe to say that you see them in all industries now taking place. These programs should not replace an ergonomics program. They should actually be a supplement to an existing ergonomics and robust ergonomics program. And they also are very effective in supporting early MSI identification and intervention, because if you think about it, everyone's together doing a group exercise, a supervisor is probably nearby. They can spot if somebody is having some difficulty with a particular exercise, may notice that something's a little awry with this particular person, and then early on they can probe, have a discussion with the worker and see if there might be any issues going on. So this early identification of a potential MSI is important to prevent the likelihood of a full-blown MSI developing eventually, or a sprain or strain from the work activities because the person wasn't able to properly stretch, and perhaps there's an issue with that particular body part. So some of the requirements of a workplace stretching program in order to have an effective program is we really need the leadership support, right? We need the buy-in. And honestly, if we don't have the buy-in of leadership, it's pretty safe to say that it's just going to be a fad and it's not going to go anywhere, and certainly not going to evolve in your workplace. The exercises should be very task focused. We want to make sure that we are warming up and stretching the parts of the body that are active for the work that's being done and the duties that are being performed. And so it should be very functional movements and warming up those particular areas. Particularly, if you're doing manual handling activities and you have to be getting down to low levels, making sure you have good or as much range of motion as your normal range of motion about your ankles and your knees and your hips and your shoulders. Supervisors, we want to make sure that they're accepting the program and also reinforcing the program. And it just sort of goes back to, if supervisors are selling it and they're encouraging it, workers are going to be more likely to follow it, and it'll be more successful. And really, it doesn't take much for a worker to identify what the priorities of a supervisor are. And if they see that it's not a priority to a supervisor, well, then it will soon become not a priority to the workers either. And corrective actions. So if you implement this warm-up program and it's been designed very effectively, strategically, safely, you have good guidance in regards to the types of exercises that are done, if any modifications are needed for a particular worker, and all that stuff is in place, but workers are not complying, well, we need to be looking at why they're not complying and getting feedback from the workers, trying to understand and troubleshoot that stuff. And if this is part of your program, your written program, health and safety program in your workplace, and workers are just not complying, well, we need to be looking at potential non-compliance procedures and actions to address that stuff. Ergonomics goes far beyond just desk ergonomics, as I mentioned earlier. So when you think of the word ergonomics, I just ask you, is that really all that you think about at this point in time or before this session? And I encourage you to think beyond that and bigger picture for sure. So if you think about it, somebody driving in a car or in an industrial vehicle, do they have the proper seat to allow them to be able to sit in a neutral posture while they're driving? Are they comfortable? Does the vehicle is it the right size and fit for their body? How long are they driving without a break and a change in posture? So we want to be looking at things like that. Manual handlers, we want to be making sure good body mechanics are used, proper equipment is provided for the work that's being done to reduce the manual load on the human body as much as possible. If you think about production line workers, we want to be looking at, are they standing on concrete floor statically for 8+ hours a day? Do we have some control measures in place? Do we have maybe some protective matting under the feet to reduce the contact stress and the stress and strain on the joints from static standing on concrete floors? Perhaps, do they have the opportunity to sit from time to time on that line, perhaps using a sit-stand stool or a leaning stool or something like that, or rotating to a different job on the line that allows them to have a change in posture. So we need to be thinking bigger picture. We have to realize that MSI risk factors are present in every type of job and occupation, and we really need to be doing a good job in identifying them, not looking at just, awkward and sustained postures, but is there vibration present? How much are they exposed? What's the magnitude of vibration? Is this a daily occurrence? Is it several times a day? We need to be looking at all of the risk factors and assessing every job task. All in all, when it comes to ergonomics, we need to make sure that workers are properly trained in the workplace to identify risk factors that are present in the work that they do. And also that they're trained to be able to know how to control the risks at their own level and to know what to do when it's beyond their control. So what are your reporting processes? What should a worker do if they know that there's a risk of an MSI or a high risk of an MSI, but they've done everything within their control and still there's high risk? So what are the reporting processes? And that's important that they be trained in that. They know what the form is, who they give it to the supervisor, and that sort of stuff. They should be able to recognize if an MSI may be developing. So those early signs and symptoms, that's really the best way to prevent a full-blown serious MSI, because, you know, many of the MSIs, they develop over time, and we do have early warning signals that is developing. So if we could just address them early on, there's a higher likelihood that the symptoms can reverse and no permanent damage is done. If you have a warm-up program in your workplace, it's important that proper training be done with workers. It's important that they understand good body mechanics, proper posture, how to do the stretches safely. And so a bit of coaching along with the workers would be very, very beneficial, and certainly recommended to make it a strong and successful program. And there's resources available for workplaces to help with this stuff. WorkplaceNL has a prevention services department. We offer free education and advice and consultation services. So you can always reach out to myself or a member of our prevention services department, and we'd be happy to assist with any of these education and training components. Also, physiotherapists, kinesiologists, you know, these types of providers, athletic therapists, OTs, they are great resources for workplaces to assist with developing strong and effective health and safe or warm-up programs. And finally, just want to say that you can't manage what you don't measure, right? So Dr. Wahl has already mentioned a little bit about this, about the importance of measuring so that you can identify ways to improve your program. Your program can't evolve if you're not effectively measuring. So ask questions, right? I understand, what is the level of participation? What is the quality of training? Are the incidents, the MSI incidents, reducing? What is the severity of the injuries? Is this reducing? Are we catching things early now? Is there good reporting processes happening? So really, you need to be doing a good assessment of your program. And also, if you can attach dollar figures to it, of course, any business likes to see positive return on investment. And if you can sell this program with you know, showing positive return on investment, well, then it's more likely that there will be future investments made into the program, for sure. It's going to be a hard sell for a business if a stretching program advocate is just, you know, asking leadership to have the workers come off the floor and lose production time, but they're not showing the tangible results.
And I think that's another thing, is that worker buy-in is going to become a really important aspect of it as well. So if you're able to show that a program, since you've implemented it, you've had a significant reduction in soft tissue injuries, which is in the individuals themselves, their friends, the people that they work with, you're going to be able to gain greater buy-in from people. So if you don't measure it and you don't look at the effectiveness of any intervention you put in place for safety, then you won't get buy-in from the teams. But if we do see a change and they know that they're having a reduced risk, then you're going to get an adoption of the program. And that's really what you want to do. You want to implement this as a long-term strategy, because that's how it works best.
So I think this is everything that we wanted to discuss today. So just to recap, we discussed many reasons why it is important to focus on MSI prevention in health and safety programs. We've talked a bit about what MSIs are and what causes them and ways that we can prevent them, specifically looking at different types of work and ways that we as individual workers can prepare our bodies to further reduce our risk. Because a lot of the risk factors we're talking about today really comes down to the worker and their willingness and ability to actually really to follow these recommendations that we're talking about. And we talked about stretching. So stretching for pre-shift warm-up for workers who do physically demanding work or active dynamic work, and also types of stretches that would be more beneficial for sedentary type workers who get very little physical activity on the job and may be dealing with muscle imbalances. So just to conclude, well, I want to thank you first and foremost for attending this session today. And if you have any further questions, then please email, because this is a recorded session, please email the Prevention Services Department with the email address safety@workplacenl.ca. So once again, thank you for joining Dr. Wahl and I, and hopefully we'll see you again soon.